All right, so in this last lesson, we're going to go over current and historical emissions and think about who is most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. So there was a couple readings from David Mackay, British physicist who wrote a whole book. It's free online if you're interested. Um, and his in the book he analyzed whether or not we can provide enough energy to satisfy the world's needs through renewable energy. Without getting into detail about his book, he also goes over some of the basics of climate change, and I think that some of what he goes over is pretty instructive. So he does admit, as I mentioned earlier, that climate models are not reliable, so we've never been able to perfectly model the climate system on a computer. It's just too complex to this point. Um, so we can't quite rely on models, although most of the models say that we indicate that we are causing climate change to occur. And so we don't know, again, we don't know for 100% certainty that climate change is 100% certainly anthropogenic. We're almost positive, but he makes the point that look, we're not 100% sure, but again, to the earlier metaphor that I mentioned earlier, that if you're riding on a fast-moving motorcycle near a cliff, but you don't know where you are, you'd probably want to slow down. So there's two important related concepts here. One is the concept of overshoot and collapse. This is normally a term used in biology when you have a population of organisms that sort of grows too quickly, and then they reach this point where there's like a lot of organisms in the area or in the ecosystem or whatever, and they're like, wow, you would think they're really thriving, but they've reached a point where they've overshot their carrying capacity, and so then the population collapses. That's a similar concept can be applied to climate change, and this is one of the really scary things about climate change. And it sort of speaks to again, McKay's analogy here that of falling off a cliff. The problem is if we ever are, as we become more certain, let's say, that humans are causing climate change, by the time we're really like, everyone's like, oh yeah, you know what, I guess we have caused this whole climate change thing. By then, it's probably too late. It's already almost certainly too late to prevent some warming from occurring. We've already seen some warming, and it looks like there's this sort of climate momentum because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. That some climate warming is already sort of the writing's already on the wall. There's not much we can do about it. So the point here is that with overshoot and collapse, by the time we're really definitive about the fact that we are the ones causing climate change, it's probably going to be too late to do to prevent. I mean, it's going to be too late to prevent it, but it'll probably be too late to really slow it down to the point that the damage is minimized. So that's one important concept here. The second one, as I mentioned earlier, is the precautionary principle, and that's basically avoiding the worst case scenario. If it's the motorcycle analogy, the worst case scenario is falling off the cliff, so you want to avoid that. If climate change, the worst case scenario is the climate is being impacted by humans and we don't do anything. So that's our worst case scenario. So a precautionary principle is say, look, let's just, we'll try to avoid that worst situation and just hedge our bets. Okay, so based on some information on who is responsible, if you look at sort of different ways to look at emissions. Now, granted, this is from a couple years ago, but if you look at the globally, China it emits more emissions than any other country in the world. Okay, so U.S. is second. These numbers are actually still pretty accurate, although they're a little bit more than this. So that's the sort of current emissions. If you look at the historical emissions, though, the US and the European Union have emitted way more CO2 than China or any other country or region for that matter over the past 250 years. Now keep in mind that CO2 does stay in the atmosphere for oftentimes hundreds, if not 1,000 years or more. And so these historical emissions, there are still CO2 molecules in the atmosphere from the early days of the Industrial Revolution. So that's your cumulative emissions. And then if you look at the per person or per capita emissions, again, we've talked about this before, the U.S., other than these really oil-rich nations of the Gulf states, the UAEs and rocks of the world, um, the U.S. is the world leader in emissions, although Australia is up there too. But anyway, You will hear out there, well, we really have to do something about China. They're the world leader in emissions. Well, sure, we do need to consider what China's doing. But if you look at the historical emissions, the US and European Union are far, far and away the bigger culprit. And also the per person, again, this is probably the most fair way to look at it, or one of the most fair ways to look at it. The US is way ahead of China and the European Union and basically anywhere else, okay? This is just another way to look at per capita. So this is your per capita emissions here. So 0 to 25 tons per person per year. The width actually tells you the population, okay? So you see the population in billions of people. So China, big population, but not a lot of emissions. They're probably up around 5 to 6 at this point. This is Australia right here and the US. So Australia is a little higher. And again, you have your Qatar and your Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. They're really high as well. The point here is that while China has a lot of total emissions, they have so many more people that, of course, I mean, they have 4 times the number of people in the United States. If all is fair, then they should emit more than us. But if you look at it on a per capita basis, China's well below us. And pretty much everybody, even these really modern countries that have, by all accounts, a really high quality of life, France, Italy, Germany, UK, all these countries, they emit significantly fewer than us. Okay, so that's another important way to look at it. But also, this is another way to look at those historical emissions. Again, the total historical emissions overall. This is United States, and then you have your United Kingdom, and China is just a fraction of the total historical emissions. Okay, so those are some final considerations to make about who is responsible for the emissions both currently and historically. And that wraps it up for our climate change discussion.